the California sun hammered down on Camp Pendleton's training range, turning the air thick and shimmering by 0900. Heat rose in visible waves from the packed earth, where Recon Marines gathered for the annual Advanced Fieldcraft Assessment, a grueling 3-day evaluation that separated pretenders from professionals. 42 operators stood in loose formation, adjusting plate carriers, checking radio frequencies, and trading quiet confidence disguised as jokes. Staff Sergeant Maya Reyes arrived alone. She stepped off a dusty transport truck with a single rucksack slung over her shoulder, her movements economical and unhurried. At 34, she carried herself with a stillness that didn't match the controlled chaos surrounding her. Her uniform was standard issue, clean but worn in ways that suggested use rather than ceremony. No flashy gear, no personalized patches, no high-speed equipment that screamed operator. She looked like someone who had been assigned to the course by accident, not someone who had earned her place. The Marines noticed her immediately, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. Sergeant Kyle Brennan elbowed Corporal Marcus Wade, tilting his head toward Maya as she set her pack down near the equipment staging area. "New transfer," he muttered. "Admin, probably. Lost on the way to the S1 shop." Wade smirked, adjusting his eye protection. "Give her 10 minutes before she realizes she's in the wrong place." Staff Sergeant Tyler Cross, a barrel-chested recon veteran with 12 years under his belt, watched Maya from across the range with narrowed eyes. He didn't laugh with the others, but he didn't intervene either. New faces always brought questions, and this one carried herself with a quietness that felt either like incompetence or something else entirely. He couldn't tell which yet. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Maya paid no attention to the stares or whispers. She moved to an empty section of shade beneath a camouflage net and began unpacking her gear with methodical precision. Each item came out in a specific order: hydration bladder first, then her poncho liner, then a small pouch containing what looked like ordinary field supplies. Nothing fancy, nothing tactical, nothing that suggested she belonged among recon operators who lived and breathed advanced reconnaissance. But the clues were there, hidden in plain sight for anyone trained to notice. When she knelt to organize her equipment, her weight shifted onto the balls of her feet automatically, not her knees. A sniper's kneel, designed to allow instant movement without sound. When she reached for her canteen, her eyes swept the perimeter first, scanning entry points and high ground before she drank. Old habit, deep habit. And when a maintenance truck backfired near the firing line, her head snapped toward the sound with a speed that didn't belong to someone unfamiliar with danger. She tracked the direction, calculated distance, and exhaled slowly before returning to her task. The reaction lasted less than 2 seconds, but it told a story her quiet demeanor tried to hide. Captain Javier Ruiz, the officer in charge of the assessment, stepped onto the range with a clipboard and a voice that carried like artillery. "Listen up. This isn't basic reconnaissance course. This isn't scout sniper school. This is advanced fieldcraft, and half of you won't finish. We're testing your ability to disappear, to observe without being observed, and to survive in hostile terrain with nothing but what you carry." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Camouflage, stalking, observation, movement discipline. If you think ghillie suits and face paint make you invisible, you're wrong. Real concealment is an art form, and most of you don't have the patience for it. Maya listened without moving, her hands resting lightly on her knees. She didn't nod. She didn't take notes. She simply absorbed the information like someone who had heard it before and already lived it. Ruiz continued. "You'll be graded on practical application. No classrooms, no lectures. You'll build your own hides, execute stalks under observation, and survive scrutiny from instructors who've done this longer than most of you've been alive. Fail any portion, you're out." The Marines around her shifted with nervous energy. Some cracked knuckles. Others adjusted their gear for the third time. Maya remained still, her breathing slow and even, her gaze fixed on the distant tree line where the first phase of training would take place. Brennan leaned toward Wade again, this time louder. "Think she even knows how to build a proper hide?" Wade snorted. "Probably thinks camouflage means wearing green." Laughter rippled through a few nearby Marines, quiet enough to avoid Ruiz's attention but loud enough for Maya to hear. She didn't react, didn't frown, didn't glance their way. Her silence only fed their assumptions. Cross watched her again, this time more carefully. Something about the way she held herself bothered him, not in a bad way, but in a way that scratched at old instincts. He'd seen that kind of stillness before. In the field, in places where movement meant death and patience meant survival. But he said nothing. Not yet. Maya rose smoothly, lifting her rucksack with one hand and slinging it across her shoulder in a motion so effortless it looked rehearsed. She walked toward the equipment distribution area, passing clusters of Marines who fell quiet as she approached, then resumed their conversations once she moved on. At the supply tent, a junior Marine handed her standard-issue camouflage materials. Netting, burlap, paracord, face paint. She accepted them without comment, her fingers brushing over the supplies with a familiarity that suggested she'd worked with far less and achieved far more. As she turned to leave, Corporal Hector Medina called out from behind her. "Hey, you sure you're in the right place? This isn't the logistics course." A few others chuckled. Maya stopped, turned slowly, and met his eyes with a calm that made his smile falter slightly. She didn't speak, didn't offer an excuse or explanation. She simply held his gaze for 3 seconds, then walked away. Medina blinked, unsure whether he'd just been dismissed or ignored. Wade muttered something under his breath, and the group moved on, convinced she was out of her depth. But Maya had already catalogued every face, every voice, every assumption they carried. She knew what they thought of her. She had been underestimated before. It never bothered her. Underestimation was often the best camouflage of all. By midday, the heat had thickened into something oppressive. Marines stripped to t-shirts, wiping sweat from their faces as they prepared their initial gear layouts. Maya worked alone in the shade, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She laid out her supplies in a grid pattern, examining each piece with quiet focus. She didn't rush. She didn't ask questions. She didn't seek advice from the instructors or camaraderie from her peers. She simply worked, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times in places far more unforgiving than a California training range. And while the Marines around her joked and postured and measured themselves against one another, Maya Reyes disappeared into her own preparation, already becoming invisible in a way they couldn't yet understand. The afternoon briefing took place under a massive camouflage net stretched between 2 poles, offering shade but little relief from the suffocating heat. Captain Ruiz stood at the front, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. Behind him, a whiteboard displayed a topographical map of the training area. Dense brush, rolling hills, scattered oak trees, and open fields that offered no mercy to the careless. "Phase 1 begins at 0600 tomorrow," Ruiz said, his voice cutting through the murmur of 42 Marines. "You'll execute a 700-meter stalk toward an observation post manned by instructors with optics, thermals, and more patience than you've got. Your job is to get within 200 meters without being spotted. If they see you, you fail." He let that sink in before continuing. "Camouflage isn't a costume. It's a discipline. Every piece of vegetation, every shadow, every texture matters. You'll be judged on your ability to blend into the environment so completely that trained eyes pass over you without recognition." Maya sat near the back, her posture relaxed but attentive. She didn't take notes. She didn't fidget. She simply listened, her mind already running through terrain analysis, approach vectors, and environmental factors she'd learned to read long before most of these Marines had enlisted. Staff Sergeant Tyler Cross stepped forward, holding up a standard ghillie suit. "This is your starting point," he said. "But if you think slapping this on makes you invisible, you're already done." Real concealment requires understanding light, shadow, depth, and movement. You need to think like the terrain, not just hide in it. Brennan leaned toward Wade, whispering just loud enough for others to hear. Bet she shows up tomorrow in full retail ghillie like it's Halloween. Wade grinned. Probably bought it online with her admin bonus. Quiet laughter spread through a few rows. Maya didn't turn, didn't react. Her eyes stayed fixed on the map, tracing lines and angles the others weren't seeing yet. Corporal Medina raised his hand. Staff Sergeant, what about natural materials? Can we supplement with local vegetation? Gross nodded. Encouraged. The best hides use what's already there. You're not trying to look like a bush. You're trying to be the bush. More snickers followed. Someone muttered, "Good luck explaining that to admin girl." This time, Maya's jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger. In resignation. She had heard variations of this dismissal for years. Different voices. Same assumptions. It never changed, and she had long stopped trying to correct it. Let them think what they wanted. The field would speak louder than any defense she could offer. After the briefing, Marines scattered to begin constructing their hides and preparing their camouflage setups. The training area buzzed with activity. Netting being cut, burlap being shredded, face paint being tested. Conversations overlapped, advice was shared, and a competitive energy filled the air. Maya moved to a secluded corner of the staging area, away from the clusters of operators working in groups. She laid out her supplies on a poncho liner, standard netting, minimal burlap, paracord, and a small collection of natural materials she'd gathered during her earlier walk around the perimeter. She didn't rush. She worked in silence. Her fingers weaving vegetation into netting with a precision that looked almost artistic. Each piece was chosen deliberately, placed strategically, and secured with knots so small they disappeared into the fabric. Brennan walked past, pausing to watch her work. He nudged Wade, who was carrying an armload of freshly cut brush. Check it out. She's making arts and crafts. Wade stopped, tilting his head. Is that a flower? Maya had woven a small cluster of dried wildflowers into the edge of her netting, blending them seamlessly with the surrounding foliage. To Brennan and Wade, it looked decorative. Unnecessary. Almost silly. Hey, Reyes, Brennan called out, louder now. This isn't a craft fair. You trying to win most creative or trying to pass the course? A few nearby Marines glanced over, some grinning, others curious. Maya didn't look up. Her hands continued their work, weaving another piece of vegetation into place with the same calm focus. Wade crouched down beside her setup, inspecting it with exaggerated scrutiny. I mean, it's pretty, he said mockingly. But pretty doesn't stop thermals from lighting you up like a Christmas tree. Maya finally lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze with a stillness that made him shift uncomfortably. Thermals read heat signatures, she said quietly. Not aesthetics. Her voice was calm. Not defensive. Not sharp. Just factual. Wade blinked, caught off guard by her directness. He stood quickly, clearing his throat. Yeah, well, good luck with that. As he walked away, Brennan called after him. Think she even knows what a thermal scope is? Laughter followed them across the range. Maya returned to her work. Unbothered. Her breathing steady. She had learned long ago that mockery was often rooted in insecurity. They didn't understand what she was building because they hadn't been trained to see it. And that was fine. Understanding would come later. Or it wouldn't. Either way, she would disappear tomorrow. And they would remember. Later that afternoon, Captain Ruiz walked the rows of Marines preparing their gear, offering corrections and guidance. When he reached Maya's position, he stopped, his eyes narrowing as he studied her setup. The netting she'd constructed was unlike anything else on the range. It wasn't bulky. It wasn't overlayered. It looked almost organic, as if the vegetation had grown naturally into the fabric rather than being attached. The colors matched the surrounding terrain perfectly, gradients of green and brown blending seamlessly without harsh transitions. Ruiz crouched down, running a finger along the edge. "Where'd you learn to build like this?" Maya kept her eyes on her work. "Experience, sir." "What kind of experience?" She hesitated for half a second, then answered simply, "The kind that matters." Ruiz studied her face, searching for arrogance or evasion. He found neither, just quiet competence. He stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "We'll see tomorrow." He walked away without another word, leaving Maya alone once again. But his pause had been noticed. A few Marines exchanged glances, unsure what to make of the interaction. Cross, who had been observing from a distance, approached Maya's position after Ruiz left. He didn't speak at first, simply stood with arms crossed, studying her setup from multiple angles. Finally, he broke the silence. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. Maya glanced up briefly, then returned to tying off a final piece of paracord. "Everyone here has done some form of camouflage training, Staff Sergeant." Cross smirked slightly. "That's not what I meant." He crouched down beside her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I've been doing recon for 12 years. I've trained with scout snipers, force recon, MARSOC. I know what standard fieldcraft looks like." He gestured toward her netting. "This isn't standard." Maya's hands stilled for a moment. She met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw something flicker behind her calm exterior. Not fear, not pride. Recognition. "I'm just trying to pass the course, Staff Sergeant," she said softly. Cross held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I bet you are." He stood and walked away, leaving Maya with the weight of his unspoken understanding. He didn't know her full story yet, but he knew enough to realize she wasn't what the others thought. And that made him curious. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the range, Maya finished her preparation. Her camouflage setup sat complete, blending so perfectly with the surrounding materials that from 10 feet away, it was almost difficult to distinguish where her equipment ended and the environment began. She sat back, exhaling slowly, and allowed herself one brief moment of satisfaction. Not pride, just acknowledgement. She had built something that would work, something that would prove what words could not. Tomorrow, when the stalk began, she would show them what real concealment looked like. Not through arrogance or boasting, through disappearance. And in that disappearance, she would remind every Marine on that range that the quietest voices often carry the sharpest skills. The evening settled over Camp Pendleton with a coolness that felt like mercy after the day's relentless heat. Marines gathered in small groups around portable lights, making final adjustments to their gear and running through mental rehearsals of tomorrow's stalk. Conversations floated through the air, a mix of bravado and genuine nerves. Maya sat alone near the edge of the staging area, her back against a wooden post, a small field manual resting in her lap. But she wasn't reading it. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slow and measured, her mind somewhere far from the California training range. Corporal Medina walked past, slowing when he noticed her stillness. He nudged Brennan. "Look at that. She's meditating. Probably trying to find her inner bush." Brennan snorted. "She's gonna need more than meditation tomorrow. That stalk course is brutal." Wade joined them, arms crossed. "I give her an hour before the instructors spot her. She doesn't move like recon." Medina tilted his head, watching Maya more closely. "How does she move?" Wade shrugged. "I don't know. Quiet, I guess. But quiet doesn't mean good." They moved on, leaving Maya in her solitude. But their observation was more accurate than they realized. Maya didn't move like recon. She moved like something older, something slower, something that had learned to survive in places where noise meant death and patience meant life. She opened her eyes as the last light faded from the sky, her gaze drifting toward the distant hills where tomorrow's stalk would take place. She knew that terrain. Not this specific range, but terrain like it. Rolling brush, sparse trees, open fields that punished the careless. She had crossed similar ground in places far more hostile than this. Places where instructors didn't fail you with a whistle. They failed you with a bullet. Staff Sergeant Cross appeared from the shadows, moving with the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect rather than demanded it. He stopped a few feet from Maya, his expression thoughtful. "You speak Spanish?" he asked suddenly. Maya looked up, surprised by the question. "Yes, Staff Sergeant." "Tagalog?" "Some." "Arabic?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Conversational." Cross's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's a strange skill set for someone assigned to admin." Maya didn't respond immediately. She held his gaze, weighing how much to reveal, how much to keep buried. Finally, she said simply, "I've worked in different places." Cross studied her for a long moment, then crouched down so they were at eye level. "You know what I think?" he said quietly. "I think you're not here because you need this course. I think you're here because someone thinks you should prove something." Maya's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't have anything to prove, Staff Sergeant." "Maybe not to yourself," Cross said. "But to them?" He gestured toward the clusters of Marines across the range. "Yeah, you do." He stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to separate the operators from the pretenders." As he walked away, Maya exhaled slowly, her hands tightening briefly around the edges of her field manual. Cross was perceptive. More perceptive than the others. That made him dangerous. Not as an enemy, but as someone who might see too much, too soon. She rose and moved toward her sleeping area. A simple tarp stretched low between two stakes. No tent, no cot, just the ground and a thin sleeping mat. She preferred it that way. Comfort made you soft. The ground kept you sharp. As she settled in, she noticed movement near the equipment tent. Captain Ruiz stood alone, reviewing notes on a clipboard, his face illuminated by the glow of a headlamp. He glanced toward Maya's position, his expression unreadable, then returned to his notes. Maya closed her eyes, forcing her mind to quiet. Tomorrow would be the first real test. Not of her ability to build camouflage, but of her ability to become nothing. To erase herself, so completely, that trained eyes passed over her without recognition. It was a skill she had mastered years ago in places where failure meant more than a failed course. It meant you didn't come home. Dawn arrived cold and pale, the sky shifting from black to gray in gradual increments that felt almost hesitant. At 0530, Marines began stirring from their sleeping positions, breath misting in the early air as they prepared for the stalk. The range came alive with muted activity. Gear being checked, face paint being applied, final adjustments made in near silence. Maya woke before the official call, as she always did. Her internal clock had been calibrated years ago to wake her 30 minutes before any official formation. A habit born from deployments where survival depended on being ready before the world demanded it. She rolled her sleeping mat with precise movements, stowed her gear, and began applying camouflage to her face and hands. She worked without a mirror, her fingers knowing exactly where to place each stroke of paint. Dark shadows under her cheekbones, light breaks across her forehead, irregular patterns that disrupted the human face's recognizable symmetry. She had done this so many times that her hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over while her mind focused on the terrain ahead. By 0600, 42 Marines stood in formation as Captain Ruiz outlined the day's exercise. The morning air carried his voice clearly across the range. "Your start point is marked with orange flags," Ruiz said, gesturing toward the distant tree line. "The observation post is 700 meters northwest, elevated on a small rise. 2 instructors will be manning optics, thermals, and scanning for any movement. Your 70 Predators objective is to close within 200 meters without being detected." He paused, letting the weight of the distance settle. "You have 4 hours. Miss the time window, you fail. Get spotted, you fail. Compromise your position through careless movement, you fail. This isn't about speed. It's about patience and discipline." Staff Sergeant Cross stepped forward, holding up a small radio. Each of you will carry a personal locator. If you're spotted, it'll vibrate once. That's your signal to extract and report to the failure line. No arguments. No second chances. Marines shifted uncomfortably. 4 hours to cover 700 meters sounded generous, but veteran stalkers knew the truth. The slower you moved, the harder it became to maintain focus. Patience was more exhausting than speed. Ruiz continued. You'll move out in pairs, staggered by 5-minute intervals. First pair departs at 0615. Questions? No one spoke. The tension was palpable, a mix of confidence and underlying nervousness. This was the moment that would separate those who understood concealment from those who only thought they did. Maya stood near the back of the formation, her camouflage netting draped loosely over her shoulders. Her face painted in earth tones that made her features almost unrecognizable. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look excited. She looked absent, as if she had already begun the process of disappearing. Brennan, standing a few rows ahead, glanced back at her and muttered to Wade. $20, says she gets spotted in the first hour. Wade smirked. I'll take that bet. I give her 30 minutes. Medina, overhearing, shook his head. You guys are brutal. We're realistic. Brennan replied. She doesn't belong here. At 0615, the first pair of Marines departed, moving toward the start line with confident strides. The range fell into a rhythm as pairs departed at intervals, each one vanishing into the brush with varying degrees of grace. Maya's turn came at 0645. She was paired with Corporal Hector Medina, who had drawn her name randomly from the roster. He approached her position with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Reyes, he said, adjusting his ghillie suit. You ready? Maya nodded once, slipping her camouflage netting over her head. The transformation was immediate and unsettling. The netting draped over her frame in a way that broke up her silhouette completely. The natural vegetation she'd woven into it, blending seamlessly with the surrounding environment. Within seconds, she looked less like a person and more like a shifting piece of terrain. Medina blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Okay. That's actually pretty good. Maya said nothing. She simply moved toward the start line, her steps so quiet that Medina had to strain to hear her boots against the dirt. They crossed the start line together and immediately split. As per protocol. Each stalker operated independently, using their own routes and techniques. Medina headed left, choosing a path through heavier brush. Maya moved right, toward more open ground that most would avoid. She dropped to her belly within the first 20 meters, becoming motionless. The stalk had begun. For the first hour, the range was silent, except for the occasional rustle of wind through dry grass. The instructors at the observation post sat behind high-powered optics, scanning the terrain with the patience of men who had done this for years. Thermal scopes cycled through sectors, looking for heat signatures that didn't belong. Binoculars swept slowly across suspected approach routes. One by one, personal locators began vibrating. A Marine moving too quickly through sparse cover. Spotted. Another attempting to cross open ground during a shadow shift. Spotted. A third whose ghillie suit created an unnatural lump against the flat terrain. Spotted. By 0800, 6 Marines had been eliminated. Their frustrated faces appeared at the failure line, where Cross waited with a clipboard, and no sympathy. What happened? Cross asked each one. I don't know, Staff Sergeant. I thought I was concealed. Thought isn't good enough. Next. Maya had covered less than 100 meters in the first hour. To an outside observer, it would have seemed impossibly slow, almost lazy, but every movement was calculated. She moved only when the wind moved the grass around her. She stopped completely when the air stilled. Her breathing matched the rhythm of the environment, slow and deliberate, as if the earth itself were exhaling through her lungs. She didn't crawl in a straight line. She curved, following natural depressions in the terrain, staying in shadows cast by scattered shrubs and rocks. She moved inches at a time, her body so low that her chest pressed into the dirt, her elbows dragging forward with a patience that bordered on meditative. At the observation post, Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez scanned his sector for the third time, his eyes burning from the strain of staring through optics. Beside him, Staff Sergeant Morris adjusted the thermal scope, watching for heat blooms that didn't match the ambient temperature. "Got movement," Morris said, his voice low. "Sector, Charlie. 270 meters." Ramirez swung his binoculars toward the indicated area. A faint shape moved through the brush, too fast, too careless. He pressed the remote signal. Somewhere in the field, a personal locator vibrated. "That's number 8. Ramirez muttered. "These guys are impatient." Morris grunted in agreement, returning his thermal scope to a slow pan. His screen showed the expected patterns: warm earth, cooler shadows, scattered heat from rocks absorbing sunlight. Nothing out of place. Then his scope passed over something strange. He stopped, reversed direction, and focused on a specific area roughly 400 meters out. The thermal signature was wrong. Not absent, but diffused. Spread out in a way that didn't match a human shape but also didn't match the terrain around it. "Ramirez, check Sector Bravo. 400 meters. Tell me what you see." Ramirez adjusted his binoculars, scanning carefully. He saw grass, rocks, a few scattered shrubs. Nothing unusual. "I don't see anything." Morris frowned, still staring at the thermal image. "There's something there. The heat pattern is off. Could be a rock. Sun's heating everything unevenly." "Maybe." But Morris didn't sound convinced. He kept his scope trained on the area, waiting for movement that never came. Maya lay perfectly still, her body pressed into a shallow depression she'd found 20 meters back. She had positioned herself so that a small outcropping of rock sat directly behind her, absorbing sunlight and creating a warm backdrop that masked her heat signature. Her camouflage netting draped over her frame in irregular folds, breaking up her shape so completely that even from 10 feet away, she would have been difficult to identify. She didn't move, didn't blink excessively, didn't shift her weight. She simply existed, breathing so slowly that her chest barely rose, her mind calm and focused on a single objective: become nothing. This was what the others didn't understand. Camouflage wasn't about hiding. It was about ceasing to exist as a separate entity. You didn't blend into the terrain. You became the terrain. Every breath, every heartbeat, every micro-movement had to align with the environment around you. The grass moved, so you moved. The wind stopped, so you stopped. The shadows shifted, so you shifted. It was exhausting, in a way physical exertion never was. Maintaining absolute discipline over your body's instinctive desire to move, to fidget, to adjust that required a mental endurance most people never developed. But Maya had developed it. Years ago. In places where the instructors weren't watching through optics. They were watching through rifle scopes. By 1,000, 14 Marines had been eliminated. The observation post had become a graveyard of failed attempts, each one a lesson in what not to do. Cross stood at the failure line, shaking his head as another frustrated Marine trudged up the hill. "You moved during a thermal scan," Cross said flatly. "Your heat signature lit up like a road flare." "I didn't think they'd see me from that far, Staff Sergeant." "That's your problem. You didn't think. You guessed. Guessing gets you killed." At the observation post, Ramirez leaned back from his binoculars, rubbing his eyes. "I'm seeing ghosts," he muttered. "Could have sworn there was movement in Sector Delta, but it disappeared." Morris glanced at his thermal scope. "I've got nothing." "Yeah, me neither, just the heat playing tricks." But it wasn't tricks. 30 meters from their position, barely visible even to trained eyes, Maya Reyes had closed to within spitting distance of the 200-meter objective line. She lay beneath a cluster of dried brush, her body so still that insects had begun crawling across her netting, without alarming her. She didn't swat them away, didn't flinch, didn't react. Movement was the enemy. Stillness was survival. Her eyes, barely visible through the gaps in her camouflage, focused on the observation post. She could see the instructors clearly now, their shapes outlined against the sky. She watched them scan, watched them adjust their optics, watched them grow frustrated as the morning wore on and fewer targets presented themselves. She was close enough to hear their voices carried on the wind, close enough to count the buttons on Ramirez's uniform, close enough to win. But she didn't move. Not yet. The exercise had a time limit, and moving too early risked exposure during the final stretch. Patience wasn't just a virtue. It was the weapon. At 1015, Captain Ruiz's voice crackled over the radio net. All remaining stalkers, be advised. Weather shift inbound. Wind increasing from the west. Maya felt it before he finished speaking. The air changed, cooling slightly, carrying the scent of distant moisture. The grass around her began moving more aggressively, swaying in longer patterns. The shadows shifted as thin clouds passed overhead. This was her moment. She moved. Not quickly. Not dramatically. She simply allowed her body to flow forward with the grass. Her movements synchronized with the environment so perfectly that she became indistinguishable from the swaying vegetation. 3 meters, pause, 2 meters, pause, 4 meters, pause. At the observation post, Morris frowned at his thermal scope. I swear something just moved in Sector Bravo. Ramirez swung his binoculars toward the area. Where? Right there. 210 meters. Just outside the objective line. Ramirez stared through his optics, his eyes straining. He saw grass moving in the wind, rocks sitting still, shadows shifting with the clouds. Nothing human, nothing out of place. I don't see it. Morris adjusted his thermal gain, trying to isolate a heat signature. The screen showed diffused warmth, but nothing concentrated enough to identify as a person. It's gone. If it was ever there. Maya crossed the 200-meter line at 1027, settling into a final position behind a fallen log that provided perfect concealment. She had completed the stalk with 23 minutes to spare, and had never once triggered the instructor's suspicion enough to warrant a signal. She lay still, waiting for the exercise to conclude. Her heart rate barely elevated, her breathing calm. Around her, the California terrain continued its morning routine, unaware that a ghost had just passed through. At 1045, Ruiz's voice echoed across the range. Exercise complete. All remaining stalkers, activate your locators for extraction. Maya reached for the small device clipped to her belt and pressed the activation button. A green light blinked twice, signaling her position to the recovery team. At the observation post, Ramirez checked his tablet as locator signals appeared on the problem digital map. His eyes widened slightly. Morris, check this out. Morris leaned over, looking at the screen. A single green dot blinked just inside the 200-meter line, in the exact area where they'd been sensing movement all morning. Someone made it, Ramirez said, his voice carrying a note of respect. And we never saw them. Morris stared at the dot, then back at his thermal scope, then at the terrain. That's impossible. We scanned that sector 20 times. Apparently not well enough. They both fell silent, staring at the small green dot that represented a stalker who had achieved what most Marines couldn't. Complete invisibility under professional observation. Down at the failure line, Cross watched as the final count came in. Out of 42 Marines, only 6 had successfully completed the stalk. And according to the data sheet in his hand, one of them was Staff Sergeant Maya Reyes. He looked up toward the observation post, then back at the roster. His expression, shifting from skepticism to something closer to acknowledgement. Well, he muttered to himself. Maybe she does belong here after all. The extraction team moved through the training area with practiced efficiency, locating each successful stalker and guiding them back to the assembly point. Marines who had completed the course emerged from their hides with exhausted relief, their faces streaked with paint and sweat, their movements stiff from hours of motionless discipline. Maya rose from her position behind the fallen log, shedding her camouflage netting with slow, deliberate movements. She rolled it carefully, securing the natural vegetation she'd woven into the fabric so it could be reused. Even now, in the aftermath of success, She moved without celebration or pride. Just quiet efficiency. The extraction Marine, a young corporal named Davies, approached her position and stopped short when he finally spotted her. His eyes widened slightly. "Jesus," he muttered. "I walked right past you twice." Maya nodded once, slinging her pack over her shoulder. That was the point. Davies shook his head in disbelief as he led her back toward the assembly area. "How long were you at the objective?" 18 minutes. 18. Davies blinked. "Ma'am, that means you finished with 23 minutes to spare?" "Yes." "And they never saw you?" "No." Davies fell silent, processing what that meant. Most successful stalkers barely made the time limit, crawling frantically toward the objective in the final minutes. Finishing with that much time to spare meant she'd moved with a speed and efficiency that shouldn't have been possible while maintaining perfect concealment. As they approached the assembly area, Marines who had already returned turned to watch. Some offered nods of respect. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the quiet supply clerk with the operator who had just outperformed nearly everyone on the range. Brennan stood near the equipment tent. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and reluctant admiration. When Maya walked past, he cleared his throat. "Reyes," he called out. She stopped, turning to face him. Brennan hesitated, then said, "That was solid work out there." It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was acknowledgement, delivered with an awkwardness that suggested he wasn't used to being wrong about people. Maya nodded once. "Thank you." She continued toward the debriefing area, leaving Brennan standing with Wade, both men exchanging glances that said more than words could. "She made it look easy." Wade muttered. "Yeah." Brennan replied quietly. "She did." At the observation post, Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez and Staff Sergeant Morris descended from their elevated position, comparing notes from the morning's exercise. Ramirez carried a tablet displaying thermal footage from the stalk, his expression thoughtful as he reviewed the recordings. "I want to see Reyes's approach," he said to Morris. "The one who finished in Sector Bravo." Morris pulled up the relevant footage, and they both watched as the thermal display showed the morning's events in fast forward. The screen displayed heat signatures moving across the terrain, most of them obvious and clumsy. Then Morris slowed the playback as it reached the 400-meter mark in Sector Bravo. The thermal signature was barely there. A faint, diffused warmth that appeared and disappeared like smoke. Even watching the recording, knowing exactly where to look, Ramirez had trouble distinguishing the human shape from the surrounding environment. "She used the rock outcropping to mask her signature," Morris said, pointing at the screen. "Positioned herself so the heated stone created a backdrop that diffused her body heat. That's professional-level fieldcraft." Ramirez nodded slowly. "And look at her movement pattern. She's not crawling in a straight line. She's following micro-terrain, staying in dead space, timing her advances with wind shifts. Who taught her to move like that? I don't know. But it wasn't basic reconnaissance course." They continued watching as the thermal signature inched forward with agonizing patience, never moving during thermal scans, never creating sharp contrasts, never compromising position. It was textbook stalking executed at a level that suggested years of experience, not weeks of training. When the footage ended, Ramirez set the tablet down and looked at Morris. "We need to talk to Cross about her." "Agreed." At the assembly area, Captain Ruiz stood before the 6 successful stalkers, his expression carrying the weight of professional respect. Behind him, the rest of the Marines who had failed the exercise stood in formation, watching with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. "Congratulations," Ruiz said simply. "You've completed Phase 1. Out of 42 Marines, only 6 of you demonstrated the patience, discipline, and technical skill required for advanced fieldcraft. That's a 14% pass rate. Some classes do worse. Some do better. But the standard remains the same." He gestured toward the observation post. "The instructors up there have been doing this for a combined 30 years. They've trained scout snipers, force recon, MARSOC operators. They know what right looks like." And this morning, 6 of you showed them right. Ruiz paused, consulting his tablet. I'm going to call out something unusual. One stalker completed the course with the highest marks we've recorded in the past 3 years. Perfect concealment. Optimal route selection. 0 compromises. Finished with 23 minutes to spare. Murmurs rippled through the formation. Even the successful stalkers glanced at each other, wondering who had achieved that level of performance. Ruiz looked up from his tablet. Staff Sergeant Reyes. Silence dropped over the assembly area like a heavy blanket. Every head turned toward Maya, who stood at the end of the successful stalker line. Her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed. She didn't step forward, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the attention in any way. Brennan's mouth fell open slightly. Wade stared, speechless. Medina, who had stalked alongside her at the start, shook his head in quiet disbelief. Ruiz continued. The instructors reviewed your thermal footage. They want to know where you learned to mask heat signatures using terrain absorption. Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was the moment she had been dreading. The moment when questions became unavoidable. Experience, sir, she said quietly. What kind of experience? The assembly area went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for her answer. Maya held Ruiz's gaze for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. Finally, she said, the kind that's classified, sir. Ruiz's eyebrows rose slightly. He glanced at Staff Sergeant Cross, who had moved closer during the exchange. His expression sharpening with interest. Classified, Ruiz repeated slowly. Yes, sir. You're telling me you have operational experience that's above my clearance level. Maya hesitated, then nodded once. Yes, sir. The weight of that admission settled over the formation like a physical presence. Classified, operational experience meant black programs. Special operations. Missions that didn't appear in official records. Cross stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying authority. Captain, permission to speak with Staff Sergeant Reyes privately? Ruiz studied both of them for a moment, then nodded. Granted. Dismissed. Reyes. Maya stepped out of formation and followed Cross away from the assembly area, walking toward a quiet section of the range where their conversation wouldn't be overheard. The other Marines watched them go, whispers beginning to spread through the ranks like wildfire. Classified experience? What does that even mean? It means she's done things we don't know about. Things we're not supposed to know about. Brennan turned to Wade, his earlier mockery completely gone. We screwed up, didn't we? Wade swallowed hard. Yeah, we really did. Cross led Maya to a shaded area beneath a camouflage net, far enough from the main group that their voices wouldn't carry. He turned to face her, arms crossed, his expression serious but not hostile. Reyes, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Maya met his eyes without flinching. Yes, Staff Sergeant. Are you currently active with a Special Operations unit? No, Staff Sergeant. But you were. It wasn't a question. Maya's silence was answer enough. Cross exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Which unit? I can't say. Staff Sergeant. Can't or won't. Both. Cross studied her face, searching for deception or evasion. He found neither. Just a woman carrying the weight of experiences she wasn't allowed to discuss. How long? He asked quietly. 6 years. And you left? Maya's expression flickered for just a moment, something painful passing behind her eyes before she locked it away again. Yes. Why? She didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, she said simply, because I needed to. Cross nodded slowly, respecting the boundary she'd drawn. He had worked with enough classified operators to know that some doors stayed closed for good reasons. Does Captain Ruiz know about your background? No, Staff Sergeant. It wasn't relevant to my current assignment. It's relevant now. Maya looked away toward the distant hills where she'd spent the morning disappearing. I didn't come here to prove anything. I came because I was assigned to the course. I'm just trying to pass and move on. Cross let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Reyes, you didn't just pass. You dominated. You made instructors with 30 years of experience doubt their own eyes. That's not just passing. That's operating at Reyes, a level most of these Marines will never reach. Maya said nothing, her jaw tight. Cross softened his tone slightly. Look, I don't need to know your full story. But the others are going to start asking questions. The instructors already are. You can't stay invisible anymore. I know, Maya said quietly. I never wanted to be visible. Then why are you here? She finally turned back to meet his eyes. Because someone thought I should remember what I used to be good at. The honesty in her voice caught Cross off guard. It wasn't pride. It was resignation. She hadn't come here to shine. She'd come here because someone, probably a well-meaning superior, thought she needed to reconnect with skills she'd tried to leave behind. Cross nodded slowly. Whoever sent you here was right. You're not just good at this, Reyes. You're exceptional. And whether you want to admit it or not, these Marines need to see what right looks like. Maya's hands tightened briefly at her sides. They don't need me, Staff Sergeant. They need better training. Maybe. But today, they got both. Cross stepped back, giving her space. Phase 2 starts tomorrow. Urban concealment and close-range observation. You planning to keep embarrassing everyone? Despite herself, the corner of Maya's mouth twitched slightly. I'll try to blend in, Staff Sergeant. Yeah, Cross said with a slight smile. Good luck with that. He walked away, leaving Maya alone beneath the camouflage net. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the ground, feeling the weight of exposure settling onto her shoulders. She had spent years trying to disappear, trying to become ordinary, trying to erase the part of herself that had been forged in classified operations and impossible situations. But the desert had other plans. And now, whether she wanted it or not, the invisible operator had become visible once again. Phase 2 began under gray skies that threatened rain but never delivered. The training area had shifted from open desert to a mock urban environment, abandoned buildings, narrow alleys, rooftops with overlapping sightlines. This phase tested a different kind of concealment, the ability to hide in plain sight, to observe without being observed in environments where natural camouflage meant nothing. Captain Ruiz stood before the remaining Marines at 0600, his breath misting in the cool morning air. The 6 successful stalkers from Phase 1 had been joined by a select group of veteran recon operators brought in specifically for the urban training. The competition had just gotten significantly harder. Urban concealment is not about ghillie suits, Ruiz began, gesturing toward the mock city behind him. It's about understanding human psychology. People see what they expect to see. Your job is to become part of that expectation while remaining functionally invisible. Staff Sergeant Cross stepped forward, holding up several items. A maintenance worker's vest, a delivery uniform, civilian clothes in various styles. You'll blend by becoming part of the scenery. A worker fixing equipment, a pedestrian checking their phone. Someone so ordinary that eyes pass over you without registering threat. He set the items down and picked up a small camera. Your objective is to photograph 3 designated targets within the urban environment without being identified by roving security teams. The security teams are played by instructors who know every trick in the book. Get caught, you fail. Miss a target, you fail. Complete all 3 without compromise, you advance to Phase 3. Maya stood near the back of the formation, her mind already analyzing the urban terrain. She noted sightlines, choke points, natural congregation areas where people would cluster. Urban environments were paradoxically easier and harder than open terrain. Easier because there were more places to hide. Harder because human behavior was unpredictable, and people noticed things that didn't fit their mental patterns. Brennan, standing a few rows ahead, glanced back at her. This time, there was no mockery in his expression. Just cautious respect and curiosity. He turned to Wade and muttered quietly, "Think she'll dominate this one too?" Wade shrugged. "Probably." Whatever she did before this, it wasn't admin work. At 0630, the exercise began. Marines departed in staggered intervals, each carrying a small camera and a basic disguise kit. The mock city came alive with activity as instructors dressed as security personnel began patrolling, their eyes sharp and their patterns deliberately unpredictable. Maya's turn came at 0715. She was issued a simple disguise, a gray maintenance coverall, a tool belt, and a worn baseball cap. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that would draw attention. She accepted the items without comment and disappeared into the urban environment. Her first target was located on the second floor of a building designated as a government office. Security was tight too. Instructors guarding the entrance, one patrolling the perimeter, cameras covering all obvious approaches. Most Marines would attempt to infiltrate through side entrances or scale the exterior. Maya chose a different approach. She walked directly toward the front entrance. Her gait changed completely. Where she normally moved with controlled precision, she now shuffled slightly, favoring her left leg as if nursing an old injury. Her shoulders rounded forward. Her head tilted down at an angle that suggested fatigue. She became, in appearance and movement, a maintenance worker at the end of a long shift. The two instructors at the entrance, Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez and a new face, Staff Sergeant Torres, watched her approach with professional scrutiny. Torres's hand moved subtly toward his radio. "Maintenance." Maya called out, her voice tired and slightly annoyed. "Got a work order for HVAC repair. Second floor. Been on call since 0400. She pulled a crumpled paper from her pocket at play. Fake work order she'd created using materials from the disguise kit. The detail was impressive. Coffee stains, wrinkled edges, authentic-looking signatures. Ramirez took the paper, examining it closely. Torres studied Maya's face, searching for recognition. They had both reviewed her file after yesterday's performance. They knew she was exceptional at fieldcraft. But standing in front of them, she looked nothing like the ghost who had dominated the desert stalk. She looked like every exhausted maintenance worker they'd ever seen on base. "HVAC's been acting up," Torres said, testing her. "What's the issue?" Maya didn't hesitate. "Thermostat calibration. Second floor's running 8 degrees hotter than specification. Probably a sensor fault, but could be the control board." The technical knowledge, delivered with the casual authority of someone who'd had this conversation 100 times, sealed the illusion. Ramirez handed back the work order and stepped aside. "Second floor. East. Wing. Don't mess with anything else." Maya nodded, her expression unchanged, and walked past them into the building. Torres watched her go, frowning slightly. "Something about her." "Yeah," Ramirez muttered. "But I can't put my finger on it." Inside, Maya moved through the corridors with the same shuffling, tired gait. She passed 2 more instructors without drawing suspicion. When she reached the second floor, she located her target, a designated high-value person, played by an instructor seated at a desk, and photographed them through a partially open door, using the small camera concealed in her tool belt. The shot took 3 seconds. Clean, unnoticed, perfect. She exited through a side door, changed her appearance slightly by removing the maintenance coverall to reveal civilian clothes underneath, and moved toward target 2. By 1100, Maya had photographed all 3 targets without a single compromise. She completed the exercise in 4 hours and 17 minutes, fastest time of any Marine that day. When she returned to the extraction point, Cross was waiting with a tablet displaying the security footage. "Walk me through it," Cross said, his tone carrying genuine curiosity. Maya reviewed the footage, pointing out her approaches. Target 1. I used established patterns. Maintenance workers are invisible because people expect them. I matched the behavior profile: tired, slightly annoyed, technically knowledgeable. Security saw what they expected to see. Cross nodded slowly. Target 2. Pedestrian disguise. I waited near a bus stop where civilians naturally congregate, then moved with a group when they crossed toward the building. Social camouflage. People in groups don't get scrutinized individually. And target 3? Rooftop observation. I accessed through an unsecured maintenance ladder, positioned myself among existing equipment, and used a ventilation unit as both cover and concealment. The target was visible through a window. The proper shot took 2 seconds. Cross studied her face. Then the footage. Then her face again. Who taught you this? Maya's expression remained neutral. Experience. That's not an answer, Reyes. It's the only one I can give, Staff Sergeant. Cross exhaled slowly, shaking his head with something close to admiration. You know what the instructors are saying about you? No, Staff Sergeant. They're saying you operate at a level they haven't seen outside of classified programs. JSOC level stuff. Tier 1. Maya said nothing, but something flickered behind her eyes, acknowledgement, pain, memory. Cross lowered his voice. Were you Tier 1, Reyes? The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I was a lot of things, Staff Sergeant. Most of them, I'm trying to forget. Before Cross could respond, Captain Ruiz approached, his expression carrying a weight that suggested news Maya wouldn't like. Reyes, we need to talk. Now. Ruiz led Maya to a small office inside one of the mock buildings, closing the door behind them. He sat on the edge of a desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I made some calls, Ruiz said. About you. Maya's jaw tightened. Sir. My record. Your record is mostly redacted, Ruiz interrupted. Which tells me everything I need to know. You weren't just special operations, Reyes. You were someone important enough that your file requires clearances I don't have. He leaned forward slightly. I spoke with someone at MARSOC. They wouldn't confirm details, but they told me one thing. If you're who they think you are, you shouldn't be here. You should be training us. Maya looked away, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. I'm not that person anymore, sir. Why not? Because that person made mistakes that cost lives. The words came out harder than she intended, sharp with pain that had been buried but never healed. Ruiz studied her face, seeing past the controlled dilder espied, exterior to the guilt etched beneath. What happened? He asked quietly. Maya shook her head. It's classified. Sir. The operation or the guilt? She looked up sharply, caught off guard by his perceptiveness. Ruiz's expression softened slightly. Reyes. I've led Marines in combat for 15 years. I know what that look means. You're carrying something heavy. Something that made you walk away from a career most operators would kill for. Maya's voice came out strained. I froze, sir. When it mattered most, I hesitated. And someone died because of it. Your spotter? Her breath caught. How? Because that's the mistake that haunts snipers. Ruiz said gently. The one where you don't take the shot, and the person beside you pays the price. Tears threatened at the corners of Maya's eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She had spent years building walls around that memory, and Ruiz had dismantled them in seconds. I can't do this again, she whispered. I can't be responsible for people's lives. You already are, Ruiz said. Every Marine in this course is watching you, learning from you. You're teaching them skills that might keep them alive downrange. That's responsibility too. Maya shook her head. It's not the same. Maybe not. But it matters. Before she could respond, the office door opened abruptly. Staff Sergeant Cross stepped in, his expression urgent. Captain, we have a situation. You need to see this. They followed Cross to the observation center, where multiple screens displayed live feeds from the urban training environment. Marines were still conducting their exercises, moving through the mock city in various states of success and failure, but Cross pointed to one specific screen. Sector 4. Watch the rooftop access. The footage showed a Marine Corporal Brennan attempting to climb to a rooftop for a better vantage point. He had bypassed security successfully and was moving with confidence. But Maya saw the problem immediately. The ladder's compromised, she said sharply. Third rung from the top. It's barely attached. Cross nodded grimly. Maintenance flagged it this morning, but the safety marker fell off. He doesn't know. On screen, Brennan reached the compromised rung. His weight shifted onto it. The metal bent. Maya didn't think. She ran. She burst out of the observation center and sprinted across the training area, her movements explosive and precise. She covered 200 meters in less than 40 seconds, her body moving with a speed that shocked the Marines who saw her pass. "Brennan!" she shouted, her voice carrying across the mock city. "Stop!" Brennan froze, one foot on the compromised rung, looking down in confusion. The metal groaned beneath him. Maya reached the base of the ladder, her chest heaving. "Don't move. The third rung is failing. Shift your weight to the building frame." Brennan's eyes widened as he felt the ladder shift beneath him. He pressed himself against the building, redistributing his weight carefully. The rung held, barely. "I'm going to stabilize it," Maya said, her voice calm despite the urgency. "When I say move, shift to the fourth rung. Understand?" "Yeah," Brennan said, his voice tight with controlled fear. Maya climbed the ladder below him, positioning herself to take some of the structural load. She braced her shoulder against the frame and gripped the ladder with both hands. "Move. Now." Brennan shifted quickly, his boot finding the fourth rung. The third rung bent further, but held long enough for him to clear it. Maya descended rapidly, and Brennan followed, both of them reaching the ground just as the compromised rung gave way completely, clattering to the pavement below. Brennan stood on solid ground, breathing hard, staring at the broken rung. Then he looked at Maya, his expression carrying something beyond gratitude. It carried understanding. "You saved my life," he said quietly. Maya shook her head. "I just saw a problem." "No." Brennan's voice was firm. "You saw a problem, reacted immediately, and risked yourself to fix it. That's not training. That's instinct. The kind you only get from real operations." A crowd had gathered, Marines, instructors, support staff. They had all watched Maya's sprint across the training area, watched her take command of a dangerous situation without hesitation. Staff Sergeant Cross pushed through the crowd, his expression a mix of relief and realization. He looked at Maya, then at Brennan, then back at Maya. "That was exceptional," Cross said. Then, louder, addressing the assembled Marines. "That was what leadership looks like. Not rank, not position. Action when it matters." The Marines stood silently, processing what they'd witnessed. This wasn't a training exercise anymore. This was real. And the quiet woman they'd underestimated had just demonstrated a level of situational awareness and decisive action that most of them aspired to. Corporal Medina, standing at the edge of the crowd, spoke up. "Staff Sergeant Cross, permission to ask Staff Sergeant Reyes a question?" Cross glanced at Maya, who nodded slightly. "Go ahead," Cross said. Medina stepped forward, his expression respectful. "Ma'am, what unit were you with before this?" The question hung in the air. Every eye turned to Maya, waiting. She looked at the faces surrounding her, young Marines who had mocked her, instructors who had doubted her, and now all of them staring with respect and curiosity they could no longer hide. Captain Ruiz appeared at the edge of the crowd. He met Maya's eyes and gave her a small nod. Permission, or perhaps encouragement. Maya took a slow breath. The walls she'd built around her past felt paper-thin now, ready to collapse under the weight of truth that could no longer be contained. "I was with the Marine Raiders," she said, quietly. "Marine Special Operations Command. MARSOC." Silence. Complete. Absolute silence. Then Medina spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was your specialty, ma'am?" Maya's hands tightened at her sides. The memory of Patrick flooded back his face, his voice, his blood on her hands. She had spent years running from that identity, burying it beneath administrative duties and quiet service. But standing here, surrounded by operators who deserved the truth, she couldn't hide anymore. "Critical skills operator," she said. "Advanced reconnaissance and surveillance. Sniper qualified." She paused, then added the detail that would change everything. Call sign. Whisper. The effect was immediate. Cross's eyes widened in recognition. Several of the veteran instructors stepped back slightly, their expressions shifting from curiosity to awe. Even Ruiz, who had suspected her background, looked stunned. "Holy shit," Wade breathed. "You're that Whisper?" Maya didn't respond, but her silence was confirmation enough. Whisper. The name existed in the gray spaces of military legend. Stories told in sniper communities, about an operator who could disappear so completely that enemies walked past without knowing death was 3 feet away. An operator who had completed impossible reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, gathering intelligence while surrounded by enemy forces. An operator who had vanished from service 3 years ago after a classified operation went wrong. Brennan's expression transformed completely. The mockery, the doubt, all of it dissolved into profound respect mixed with something close to shame. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, and brought his hand to his brow in a sharp, crisp salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying weight. "Thank you. For everything." The salute caught Maya off guard. She hesitated, then slowly returned it, the muscle memory of leadership responding even as her mind resisted. One by one, others followed. Medina saluted. Then Wade. Then the instructors Ramirez, Morris, Torres, all of them bringing their hands to their brows with the kind of respect reserved for combat veterans who had earned it in the hardest ways possible. Cross stepped forward and saluted as well, his voice steady. "It's an honor, ma'am." The crowd of Marines, nearly 60 strong now, stood at attention. The salutes rippled through the formation like a wave, each one offered with genuine reverence. Maya stood at the center of it all, surrounded by respect she had never asked for and recognition she had tried to escape. Her eyes moved from face to face, seeing young operators who would deploy someday, who would face dangers she had already survived, who needed the knowledge she carried. She understood now what Ruiz had been trying to tell her. This wasn't about her guilt or her past. This was about what she could give to the Marines standing in front of her. Knowledge that might keep them alive. Skills that might bring them home. She had spent 3 years hiding from who she was. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding. Captain Ruiz stepped forward, his hand still at his brow in salute. When Maya returned it, he lowered his arm slowly, his expression carrying a complexity that went beyond simple respect. "Staff Sergeant Reyes," he said formally, his voice carrying across the assembled formation. "On behalf of this command and every Marine here, I want to apologize." Maya blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, that's not, it is necessary," Ruiz interrupted gently. "We made assumptions about you based on your current assignment. We saw a supply specialist and presumed limitations. We failed to recognize that some of our most skilled operators choose to serve quietly after giving everything on the front lines." He paused, his jaw tightening with emotion that he struggled to contain. "You came to this course because someone thought you needed to remember your skills. But I think we're the ones who needed the reminder. A reminder that expertise doesn't announce itself. That the quietest voices in the room are sometimes the most experienced. That we should never, ever underestimate the Marine standing beside us." The words landed heavily on the formation. Several Marines, including Brennan and Wade, lowered their gazes, the weight of their earlier mockery settling onto their shoulders like physical pressure. Ruiz took a breath, then continued. "According to the information I've been able to access, which is limited given your classification level, you completed 7 deployments with MARSOC. You conducted reconnaissance operations in some of the most dangerous territories our nation has engaged in. You gathered intelligence that directly led to the successful completion of multiple high-value target operations." He looked directly at Maya, his voice softening. "And 3 years ago, during Operation Silent Horizon, you lost your spotter in a firefight, Patrick Coleman. After that, you requested reassignment to non-combat duties and have been serving in logistics ever since." The name Patrick Coleman sent a visible shock through Maya's frame. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled slightly before she forced them still. She hadn't heard his name spoken aloud in 3 years. Hadn't allowed herself to think it, even in private moments. Tears threatened, but she fought them back with the same iron discipline she'd used to survive impossible situations. Ruiz's voice dropped even lower. Meant primarily for her but still audible to those nearby. You blamed yourself for his death. And you've been punishing yourself ever since by hiding skills that could save lives. Maya's voice came out strained. Sir, I froze. I had a shot, and I didn't take it. Patrick died because I hesitated. No. The word came from Staff Sergeant Cross, who stepped forward to stand beside Ruiz. Patrick died because war is chaos, and sometimes even perfect operators face impossible choices. Cross turned to address the formation. I looked up Operation Silent Horizon after I suspected Staff Sergeant Reyes's background. The after-action reports are heavily redacted, but I found enough. She and her spotter were conducting reconnaissance on a high-value target when they discovered civilians in the kill zone. Children. Staff Sergeant Reyes held fire to avoid civilian casualties. The target's security spotted their position and engaged. Patrick Coleman provided covering fire so she could escape. He saved her life by making that choice. Maya's control shattered slightly. A single tear escaped, cutting through the camouflage paint still streaked across her face. She wiped it away quickly, but not before several Marines saw it. Cross continued, his voice firm. That's not failure. That's an operator making the right call under impossible circumstances. Choosing to protect innocent lives, even when it complicated the mission. That's the definition of honor. The formation remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had been awe and respect deepened into something more, profound understanding. They were witnessing not just a skilled operator, but a human being carrying wounds that hadn't healed. Ruiz spoke again. Staff Sergeant Reyes, I cannot change what happened. I cannot ease your guilt, but I can tell you this. Patrick Coleman's sacrifice meant you survived. You carried forward the knowledge you both possessed. And today, you used that knowledge to save Corporal Brennan's life. He gestured toward Brennan, who stood at attention, his eyes red. You prevented another death, Ruiz said. Not through violence or combat, but through awareness and action. That's Patrick's legacy continuing through you. That's his sacrifice meaning something. Maya's throat tightened. She couldn't speak, couldn't trust her voice. All she could do was nod slowly, acknowledging truth she had never allowed herself to accept. Brennan stepped forward, his movements hesitant. When he reached Maya, he spoke quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Ma'am, I'm sorry. For every joke, every laugh, every time I dismissed you. He swallowed hard. You saved my life today, and I treated you like you didn't belong here. I was wrong. Completely wrong. Maya looked at him, this young Marine who reminded her painfully of Patrick at that age, confident and eager and still innocent of the costs that come with combat. You didn't know, she said softly. You weren't supposed to know. But I should have respected you regardless, Brennan insisted. You don't owe me forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. Maya studied his face, seeing genuine remorse, seeing the kind of growth that happens when pride meets humility and loses. She extended her hand. You have it, Corporal. Brennan gripped her hand firmly, his salute somehow contained in the handshake itself. When he stepped back, Wade and Medina moved forward, each offering similar apologies, each received with quiet grace. Captain Ruiz watched the exchanges, then addressed the formation one final time. Effective immediately, Staff Sergeant Reyes will serve as lead instructor for the remainder of this course. She will teach you what the manuals can't. How to truly disappear. How to observe without being observed. How to survive in environments that punish the careless. He paused, his expression hardening slightly. And every single one of you will treat her with the respect her experience and sacrifice have earned. Is that understood? Yes, sir. The response thundered across the training area, unified and absolute. Ruiz turned to Maya. Staff Sergeant, do you accept this assignment? Maya looked at the faces surrounding her young Marines, who would deploy soon, who would face dangers she understood too well, who deserved every advantage she could give them. She thought of Patrick, of his smile, of his voice saying, "Teach them. When this is over, teach them everything." She had promised him. In the moments before he died, she had promised to carry forward what they'd learned, together. And then she had spent 3 years running from that promise. "Not anymore." "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady. "I accept." The final 2 weeks of the Advanced Fieldcraft Assessment transformed completely under Maya's instruction. What had been a standard course became something approaching legend, the session where Whisper emerged from retirement to teach the next generation of Recon Marines how to become ghosts. Maya taught without ego or drama. She simply demonstrated, explained, and demanded excellence. She showed them how to read terrain not just for cover, but for psychology, where human eyes naturally avoided looking, where assumptions created blind spots, where the brain filled in details that weren't actually there. She taught them urban camouflage techniques that went beyond disguises, how to match stride patterns to local populations, how to use reflective surfaces to observe without being seen, how to position yourself in crowds so you became invisible through social dynamics. She demonstrated stalking techniques that defied standard doctrine, showing them how patience wasn't measured in time but in breaths, how to move with the environment rather than through it, how to let the terrain dictate your movements instead of forcing a predetermined path. And she shared the lessons that hurt the most, the mistakes she'd made, the consequences she'd lived with, the importance of making hard choices even when every option felt wrong. The Marines absorbed everything with a hunger Maya hadn't expected. They asked questions that challenged her, pushed themselves harder than she demanded, and transformed from operators following checklists into adaptive thinkers who understood that fieldcraft was an art, not a science. By the final exercise, a 3-day reconnaissance mission in mountainous terrain, the performance level had risen dramatically. Marines who had failed Phase 1 returned and succeeded. Marines who had barely passed earlier phases now executed with confidence. The failure rate dropped from 86% to 42%, a statistical anomaly that would be studied for years. On the last day, as the sun set over Camp Pendleton, the Marines gathered for the final debrief. Maya stood before them, her expression calm, her posture relaxed. "You came here to learn advanced fieldcraft," she said quietly. "And you learned techniques, tactics, procedures. But the most important thing you learned is something else entirely." She paused, letting silence settle. "You learned that expertise often hides. That the person you underestimate might be the one who saves your life. That quiet competence matters more than loud confidence. And that the Marines standing beside you, regardless of their current assignment, carry experiences and knowledge you should respect." She looked across the faces, seeing not just Marines but individuals who had grown over the past 3 weeks. "Some of you will deploy soon. You'll face environments that punish mistakes and reward patience. Remember what you learned here. Not just the techniques, but the mindset. Be the operator who observes before acting, who thinks before moving, who respects the terrain, the enemy, and the Marines beside you." Captain Reyes stepped forward, holding a small wooden plaque. "Staff Sergeant Reyes, on behalf of this command, we want to present you with this." Maya accepted the plaque, reading the engraving. "In recognition of exceptional instruction and leadership, your skills, sacrifice, and dedication to the next generation of warriors will never be forgotten. Whisper, silent guardian, eternal teacher." Below the inscription were listed the names of every Marine who had completed the course under her instruction. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she held the plaque. She looked up at Reyes, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," Reyes replied. "You gave these Marines something no manual can teach. You gave them yourself." The formation snapped to attention as one unified movement. Every Marine brought their hand to their brow in perfect salute. Not the quick, casual salute of routine, but the slow, deliberate salute reserved for moments that matter. Maya returned it, her eyes moving from face to face, memorizing the moment. When the salutes lowered, Corporal Brennan stepped forward carrying a small box. He opened it to reveal a hand-carved wooden token, no larger than a challenge coin, with an intricate design. A whisper of wind moving through grass, so detailed it seemed to move in the light. "Ma'am," Brennan said, his voice steady, "we had this made for you. Every Marine in this class contributed. It's meant to represent what you taught us, that strength doesn't need to be loud. That some of the most powerful forces in nature make no sound at all." He placed it in her hand, his fingers lingering for a moment. "Thank you for saving my life. And thank you for teaching us how to save others." Maya closed her fingers around the token, feeling its weight. It was small, but it carried the collective gratitude of Marines who would deploy with skills that might bring them home. Skills she and Patrick had learned together in places most people would never know existed. "Thank you," she whispered. 3 months later, Maya stood in her small office at the logistics center, reviewing inventory reports on her computer. The work was quiet, methodical, familiar. But something had changed. She no longer saw it as hiding. She saw it as service. Different service, but service nonetheless. On her desk sat 2 items that hadn't been there before. The wooden plaque from Camp Pendleton and the carved token from Brennan. Beside them, a small framed photo she'd finally allowed herself to display her and Patrick in Afghanistan. Both smiling, both young, both believing they were invincible. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Staff Sergeant Cross standing in the doorway, out of uniform, wearing civilian clothes. "Reyes," he said with a slight smile. "Got a minute?" "Of course, Staff Sergeant." Cross stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I'm not here officially. I'm here as someone who respects what you did and wants to make you an offer." Maya raised an eyebrow. "What kind of offer?" "The Advanced Fieldcraft Assessment is running again in 6 months. Captain Ruiz wants to know if you'll come back as lead instructor. Not temporary. Permanent position." Maya leaned back in her chair, processing the offer. 6 months ago, she would have refused immediately. 6 months ago, the thought of returning to that world would have triggered panic and guilt. But now, "I'd have to think about it," she said honestly. Cross nodded. "That's fair. But before you decide, I want you to know something. 3 of the Marines from your class deployed last month. They're in Syria conducting reconnaissance operations. Last week, they successfully infiltrated an enemy position, gathered critical intelligence, and extracted without compromise." He pulled out his phone, showing her a message. "This is from Corporal Brennan. I thought you should see it." Maya read the message. "Staff Sergeant Cross. Tell Whisper that her lessons saved our lives today. We moved the way she taught us. We waited when instinct said rush. We disappeared when enemies walked past. Everything she gave us mattered. We're coming home because of her. Please tell her thank you. And tell her Patrick would be proud." Maya's vision blurred. She blinked rapidly, forcing back tears that came despite her control. Cross's voice softened. "You're making a difference, Reyes. Not with bullets. With knowledge. That's a different kind of warfare. But it's just as important." Maya looked at the photo of Patrick, then at the carved token, then back at Cross. "Tell Captain Ruiz I'll do it," she said quietly. "Permanent position. I'll teach them everything I know." Cross smiled, extending his hand. "Welcome back, Whisper." She shook his hand, feeling something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose without guilt. Contribution without fear. A way forward that honored the past without being trapped by it. Some warriors fight with weapons. Others fight with wisdom. Maya Reyes had been both. She had operated in the darkest places, made impossible choices, and carried the weight of consequences that would break most people. She had lost her partner, blamed herself, and spent years trying to disappear from a life that demanded too much. But she learned something on that California training range. You can't outrun who you are. You can only choose how to use it. She chose to teach. To pass forward, the lessons earned in blood and sacrifice. To give young Marines the skills that might bring them home to families who would never know how close they came to loss. That's not hiding. That's legacy. Patrick Coleman died saving his partner, but his knowledge, his techniques, his approach to reconnaissance, all of it lives on through the operator he protected. Through the Marines she teaches. Through the lives saved by skills passed down from one generation to the next. Some heroes charge into battle. Others ensure the next generation can survive it. Both are warriors. Both matter. Both deserve our respect. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one. True strength often whispers. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists, quiet and powerful, waiting for the moment when someone's life depends on it. Maya Reyes taught 42 Marines that lesson. She showed them that the person you underestimate might be the one who saves you. That quiet competence outweighs loud confidence. That respect should be given based on character, not assumptions. And most importantly, she proved that redemption doesn't come from erasing the past. It comes from using the past to build a better future. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These stories keep their courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.